All right, so now let's talk a little bit, dive into the whole idea of highlights. And what I'm talking about, it's a little bit better to be overexposed than underexposed. And I'm going to start out with this image that's my buddy, that's David Carr. He's a drummer. And I took this picture, and it's nice, but it's a little dark. And so what I would want to do is I hit auto and let it try to crank up some stuff, and look, the exposure, it bumped it up 2.55 stops, or a bunch of increasing there. And I find oftentimes the exposure is a little hot, so I want to bring that down to begin with. But even so, when I have to, if I want to open up the shadows or whatever, what's going on is when I come in and zoom in, it starts adding noise. You can start to see noise, especially in the dark areas. And the more I open up the shadows, watch this, you see how much noise starts to come into play in there. So yeah, I can open it up. I could recover a pretty good amount of darkness. I could really open up the shadows in those dark areas. You can almost read the computer or whatever, but it's at the cost of bringing in a lot of noise. Whereas, let's look on this side right here. We've got this image, and if it's reset, you'll notice right, especially in here, it's bright, and let me zoom in on this. You can see that there's some clipping going on right in this area with you're losing some of the detail. And you can see if I turn on my clipping mask, well, it's right on the edge. You got clipping going on here. Well, watch what happens when I just drag the highlights. I no longer have the clipping going on, but it's not really introducing any noise. As a matter of fact, I can bring back a lot of detail in that shirt. Let's go back here. Let's look at before. See the clipping there, and now if I drag the highlights back over, we get more detail in the shirt, and it does it without incorporating a lot of noise. And so what highlights doing, if you pay attention to the sliders up here, and I should have pointed this out with black and whites, as soon as I put my slider over blacks, notice this area in here lights up, and it's the blacks. If I go over to this area, that's the shadows. This is your exposure, what it kind of wants to work in the middle. Then you've got your highlights and then your whites. So when I'm working on highlights, watch, it lights up right there, and that's where it's trying to have most of its influence. So just realize that highlights are going to be a big savior. If you overexpose a lot, especially like your skies, you can bring back a lot of clouds and stuff like that. But this is where RAW really trumps JPEG. Let me show you what's going on. This is a RAW image. Let me compare it to a JPEG image. Let me show you the difference. Here's a picture of one of my sons. Yes, he's looking terrible as he's running cross country. This is where I was shooting a lot of sports stuff. So I was shooting JPEG, but this is where it caught me, because one minute I'm shooting into the shade and then I'm out in the sunlight, and my boys are a little bit white-skinned. They're pretty light-skinned, redhead, you know, they're wearing dark shorts, so I've got this lovely contrast going here. So now I bring this into Lightroom and go, aha, no problem. I'm going to crank up the highlights and bring some of this back in. I crank highlights all the way over, and then I can even bring the exposure all the way down. But look, there is no information in his legs right here, in the shirt and this stuff. No matter how much I use my highlights slider and exposure, there's just not any information in there, because the JPEG kind of cranks stuff down. And that's the difference with highlights and blacks and whites with RAW versus JPEG. You just don't have as much of a recoverability in a JPEG versus a camera RAW. Notice, I mean, here, if we go back to reset and we zoom out, let's reset it, and we put the clipping on, this thing has no detail in it whatsoever. But if I bring back the highlights, it takes care of all that, because there's so much information still in the RAW file that it can grab. So that's one of the things you need to think about when you're shooting. If you're in a comfortable setting where you know you're going to nail the exposures, and you have enough latitude with the highlight sliders, JPEG is fine. But if you're not sure about it, you may want to stick with RAW, so that you have a little more highlight latitude to bring back in some of that detail. But that's what goes on with the highlights and even the shadows. So I hope that helps you understand those a little bit more.